The first Hellblade game, Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, was phenomenal. It blew me away the first time I played it. I had gone in with little expectations. I had just seen the cover art and I went into it blind and played it for myself, and it has become one of my favorite games of all time. It still sits in my top 10. That's how much I love that game. Because it did something different than a lot of games I had played in previous years, especially at that point in my life. The game was released around 7 years ago, but I picked it up a couple of years later in 2019. And compared to all the games that I'd played up until that point, while there were some incredible games and incredible experiences, there was something really different and unique about this one that I had never experienced before. At that point, I wasn't a huge horror fan. Not even for video games. My tastes in the genre would really only extend to zombie-related media like Dead Space, The Walking Dead, and The Last of Us, which became my favorite game when that came out. But I decided to broaden my horizons and try out Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice. It's a game that deals with trauma and grief through the lens of psychosis. That was a thing I didn't know could be explored and presented in this way. I was blown away by this game, not only because of the visuals, especially for that time and from a smaller studio, but the sound design and engaging story. I hadn't experienced any audio design like that before. The use of binaural audio to illustrate how it might feel for someone to experience what Senua does and hear all the voices was deeply terrifying to me because it just put me on edge and it raised the tension. It created anxiety and blurred the lines between what was real and what wasn't. It was something that I just never experienced before. And then, with all the visuals that detail how Senua views the world, coupled with that, made her a far more admirable and likable character because of how brave it shows she is. She's pressing forward no matter the odds to retrieve the soul of her dead lover from Hela, a huge undertaking, especially considering her psychosis and all that she endures. And during that 8-hour campaign, where I thought I needed to take a break from it, the anxiety really got to me each time I played it, in a cold, isolated room in the middle of the night, 2 floors below everyone else. But it was just something so astonishing, and the experience of it only made me sympathize with the idea of someone experiencing something akin to this in real life. And that was its goal, to highlight mental health and to show how people living with psychosis are not monsters. It humanizes them in a way that most media cannot really achieve. And media in the past, more specifically film and television, never really did a great job representing this and would often dehumanize instead. But this game really resonated with me, and the themes and all the things that Senua deals with and endures through that journey was just an incredible experience like none other, and one that I will never forget. And recently, I had actually briefly revisited it in preparation for its sequel. I wanted to see how the game still holds up, and to see if I still feel the same way that I do. Do I look at this game through rose-tinted glasses? And I'm gonna say that while I still hold it near and dear to my heart, and I still think that it did a great job in accomplishing what it did at the time, I didn't feel the same way this time around. Because 1, I probably just knew what to expect having played it before, and 2, it's been several years since then where I have played and explored many other games where I've grown accustomed to things like the newer Resident Evils, and now with the more recent Alan Wake 2, all of which are survival horror games that share similar design. And since then, the horror genre has become one of my favorite genres there is. I think over time I've just become desensitized to them, and so I didn't really feel the same way I did the first time around when playing Senua's Sacrifice. The focus of the original game was never really on the gameplay. Some people may not like this type of game, and that's fair. People like different things. But the goal of the game was never to excel at gameplay. Rather, it was just a mode of telling its story that it felt was best effective as a video game. Because though the puzzles themselves were fairly straightforward, and the combat encounters too, the primary goal was to craft a game with a compelling narrative and an experience different to others. It's very much an art house game. But that brings me to Senua's Saga, Hellblade 2. While I don't expect the sequel to reinvent the wheel and do something entirely different, I would expect there to be some necessary innovations, especially with this bigger budget, making changes and iterations that build upon its predecessor in a meaningful way, one that you expect to elevate. And it does that, but only really in one regard. The game is visually stunning. It's probably the most gorgeous and breathtaking game I have ever seen, period.
You're breathtaking!
At least for now. And I've never seen a game with graphics quite like this. From its art direction to its graphical fidelity, every inch of this game is nothing short of wonder, and it feels like it's always begging for the use of photo mode at every turn. Like, if you are somebody that loves photo mode and you love virtual photography, this game is for you. You probably aren't going to spend much time playing this game because you're just going to be so enthralled using photo mode like every step of the way. That's how beautiful and amazing this game looks, even with its weird chromatic aberration. And of course, the sound design is still great as always, but I didn't feel that sort of same tension or feeling of being on edge the same way that I did when I discovered the first Hellblade. It might be due to my desensitization towards these types of games and their atmosphere. Though on the other hand, Alan Wake 2 had me more on edge and feel more immersed through all 20 hours. And I guess I wasn't really necessarily expecting it to feel exactly the same way as the first game, but maybe approach it in a different way that would elicit some of the same feelings. Unfortunately, I did not get that here. I felt like it was fine, but not in a way that fully engrossed me in the way that I would hope. Otherwise, technically speaking, yes, it's a step up in terms of audio design and visuals. The voice acting and the facial animations are all of course top notch. Like this, if anything, is an incredible Unreal Engine 5 tech demo that showcases how much of a graphical powerhouse it can be and what the engine is capable of. It can render environments and particle effects and lighting all so incredibly well, and every detail leaves you in awe. And while the performances from the actors, especially our lead played by Melina Jurgens, who will no doubt at least be nominated at the Game Awards later this year, are also incredible, it is elevated by the small details and subtle expressions that could never be captured quite the same before. This is an art house game and it wears it on its sleeve. The first one was, and so was this one. But unfortunately, this is kind of where it gets disappointing, because that's about as good as it gets for me. There's a lot left to be desired when it comes to every other component of this game. I know a lot of people love to throw that meme around and call many games a walking simulator. As somebody who really enjoys quote-unquote walking simulators and loves narrative games, this one really just didn't click for me the way the first one did. The game will run you about 6 to 7 hours, about an hour or so less than the original game. Now, don't get me wrong, length is not indicative of quality. I am very well aware of that, and I would rather a 10-hour game that focuses on quality than a 100-hour game that doesn't prioritize it as much, or one that feels more unnecessarily bloated. I'll even take 5 hours if those 5 hours are some of the best 5 hours that I'll ever experience. An experience that would only ruin itself if it were any longer. But that isn't always the case. Short and sweet can be really nice as long as you know what you're doing and you know how to tell a story in that amount of time. But sometimes quantity can really help play a role in accelerating the quality as well. If you've written any paper in college or university or wherever, if you've written any sort of essay or any piece where you're explaining something, or maybe you've even done a YouTube video review like this one, you'll know that quality can sometimes go hand in hand with quantity. Sure, you might be able to write an incredible essay that's about 5 pages long versus maybe 10 pages long, but sometimes it's necessary to let it breathe and expand, and to really flesh out those ideas to help get your point across better. And so instead of it only being 5 pages, you are now able to write 10 pages or 15 pages, and it's not 10 pages of fluff, it's 10 well-written quality pages. It allows you the chance to include all your different ideas rather than just trying to cram them into those 5 short pages. And that's exactly what this game feels like. This game is far too short for its own good. In my opinion, I really do think it could have used at least a few extra hours to really flesh it out and lengthen its plot, which really suffered because of this. Because the plot, the characters, and its pacing all struggle in my opinion. And when you're developing a game, you need to be able to carefully balance out both gameplay and narrative, toe the line, and be able to pace them really well in such a way that not only maintains the flow, but keeps your audience engaged. And that's why, even though I'm well aware that this is meant to be a story-first type of game, and I love those kinds of games, and I understand that there are various games that try to achieve different things, this one fails to successfully do that too. In the first game, a lot of it is walking and solving puzzles that are fairly straightforward, that don't take a whole lot to figure out. Sometimes it does take a little bit of moving around, repositioning yourself, but you usually figure it out pretty quickly. And even if you're not really a fan of the puzzle design in this game, a lot of the sort of ideas and concepts are more forgivable because 1, it's a smaller scale game. It was never meant to be this sort of big thing with a complex gameplay system. And 2, it felt like the puzzles and even combat all served the game's narrative. A narrative that really was mostly just a character study of Senua. The voices, or the Furies, in her head were characters as well in their own right. They were her companions, but were also mere voices that contributed to her isolation and self-doubt. And the entire experience always felt like it was in service to the plot and her development as a character. A character trying desperately to overcome a grief and past trauma, which unfolds, and you learn more about it organically as the game moves forward. Now, in all honesty, I really think that sometimes a piece of media is best left alone as a standalone piece. But they made a sequel nonetheless, and so, with a sequel, it creates certain expectations. With a sequel, you come to expect better gameplay that is engaging, and that doesn't feel super repetitive or barely iterative of the first game. You expect better puzzle design or something new and fresh. Or at the very least, for a sequel such as this one that prizes itself on narrative, you expect it to write something just as, or more compelling. Obviously, the core game mechanics don't need to drastically change. It is a sequel after all, I don't expect them to. Like, for example, going from God of War to God of War Ragnarok, they don't drastically change, but they introduce new elements to them. They introduce things that are sort of slightly unique to each game that makes them always interesting and fun, and serve the narrative that they're trying to tell, even when retreading similar ground. But yeah, the puzzles seem much simpler this time around, at least to me. Maybe it's because I've again become more experienced over time, but I really thought that it wasn't really that interesting. None of the puzzles, while they look great and everything visually looks great all the time, just kept me hooked or engaged in any way. I didn't really think much of them. I didn't really feel like my brain was getting as much engagement as it could have been. I understand that these games are about Senua's psychosis, and the Furies play a prominent role as I had mentioned, but I don't know why, but for some reason in this game, they felt more like a nuisance. The tension they brought in the first one was important, and it kept me at the edge of my seat. It's part of what had me terrified and amplified, as I said, her isolation. But in this one it seemed like they wouldn't stop, and really never felt like they actually contributed to any emotions or any part of the gameplay or narrative. It actually detracted in some regards. For example, the Furies would often talk over other characters, and so it would make it harder to focus on what they're saying. It was incredibly distracting. And before you comment, that's the point, she's supposed to hear it. There's nothing about that experience that aids the story. It just makes the audience more annoyed and less engaged. There needed to be a better balance of that, and that's what made it so powerful in the first. They didn't hold your hand nearly as much. For puzzles, they would constantly be trying to draw my attention when I'm already about to figure out the solution, yet they kept going. It felt a bit like Atreus in God of War, where he's pointing out the solution before you even have a chance to think.
Oh, I think I get it. If you freeze the geyser, the pressure will turn the wheel.
It was infuriating. Yeah, forgive me. But yeah, it did become frustrating. It ruined key, pivotal, and emotional moments because instead of the classic show don't tell, it was very much just tell. They'd often describe exactly how Senua or another character was feeling. It's like Ninja Theory doesn't trust their audience's intelligence enough to understand their emotions that they're conveying. But isn't it ironic? Because isn't that the very reason they're flexing their graphical fidelity? To show how detailed and subtle their facial animations were and how great their actors can convey these emotions? It just doesn't make sense and doesn't work for this type of story. As you may have heard, this game runs at 30 FPS and is locked to it on the Series X. This is not uncommon these days, unfortunately, but I don't cry over it not reaching 60 either, especially in cases like this where it's not meant to be combat or traversal heavy, at least in ways that don't demand very fast-paced or fluid moment like Devil May Cry or Final Fantasy or something. It also has a letterbox throughout. The Order 1886 did as well, and that game caught a lot of flack for a lot of the same reasons that this game did. The aspect ratio is kept this way for a reason. 1, it looks more cinematic, and 2, more importantly, it boosts performance because it doesn't really need to render as many pixels on the screen at a time, so you can retain all that graphical fidelity. Sure, this wasn't a huge deal for me either, although I'd much prefer if we took advantage of the full screen real estate for better immersion. And I mean this for us non-widescreen users, by the way. And again, I want to make this clear, I don't mind it that much, but I'd much rather have graphics that maybe aren't quite as good as these, but still have smoother performance. Take Alan Wake 2 for example, which released at the end of last year. That game did a whole lot right that this didn't. Not only because it was nearly 4 times as long, which gave it more time to flesh out its characters, but it still looked fantastic and was far more engaging even though the graphics weren't quite as good. And if you ask most people, I'm sure they will choose smooth gameplay and performance over very pretty visuals any day. I mean, even the previous game looked phenomenal at the time, and while Senua did have to make a sacrifice, it definitely was not in performance. And to add to this, the combat isn't great either. In my experience, in some ways it's more clunky and requires less input than before. People will post clips all over Twitter about how great the combat looks, and I won't deny it looks great, but it looks better than it actually plays. And this is one I've seen very polarizing opinions of. I mean, the whole game really is polarizing, but especially this. And I wasn't sure if I was wrong about how the combat felt. And I was thinking, maybe just within a week I had already forgotten what the combat was like in Senua's Sacrifice. Then, as I was writing this, I went back to sections with combat and I played them back to back to compare the two, and yeah, the combat in the first is better. In Hellblade 2, Senua doesn't deal with more than one enemy at a time, whereas in the first, multiple enemies can attack her left and right. It raised the stakes and the tension, and even the false sense of permadeath they gave you at the beginning really heightens that, and it made sense that her swings were messy and chaotic. She was inexperienced. But in this one, we have a more mature Senua who now sees her psychosis as more of a tool and less of a burden. She's gained experience, and thus her swings should be more calculated than they are, but they don't feel it. Apparently they decided to have you battle them one-on-one because Ninja Theory was inspired by the Battle of the Bastards in Game of Thrones, but I don't think this works the way that they thought. It's strange that each enemy waits to tackle her instead of multiple at once, when in the previous installment, they didn't. And the combat is really limited to mastering your parries, but the window is incredibly small. So small, it feels inconsistent. There were times where I was successful, and other times I had no idea when it worked. I'm not sure if the lower frame rate also played into this, but I doubt it helped. In the first one, you could also do a full dodge roll that would allow you to attack from the side. Here, you can evade and roll slightly, but never fully enough that it actually presents any real sort of advantage. A lot of the time, these encounters can be pushed through by using a mirror of sorts that acts as your rage mode, that allows for Senua to briefly slow down time and get a few extra hits in. And if you're wondering why it looks better than it is, it's because even though Ninja Theory stated that they were able to capture more in a full studio environment, it seems like it was really just for scripted animations. There's definitely a lot more of those that make it look more fluid, but that's it. The entire thing just looks really cinematic and nice, but it fails as an actual active combat system. Now don't get me wrong, it's not the worst, it's serviceable enough, but it definitely felt like a step down for me, save for a few moments towards the end that looked really cool. But okay, let's ignore the puzzles and the combat, which is largely what makes up the gameplay apart from the copious amounts of walking. Because the narrative here is what's important, right? That is the claim that they've made, and it apparently is what they started with first, and was the focus of this game. Again, as I've mentioned, with Senua's sacrifice, even if you weren't a huge fan of the gameplay, the story was so well told, it held much of it together. Unfortunately, I can't say the same here. If you're not going to do the gameplay well, then you better have an extraordinary story to tell. Otherwise, what else have you got? Now I get it. Like with any story, it may resonate for some and not so much for others, and I'm in the latter camp with this one. First off, I felt like this game was far too short, and lengthening it and spending extra time on the story and the characters could have easily elevated this a few levels. While the actors embodied their characters incredibly well and had some really captivating performances, they got shortchanged due to the lack of screen time. I did not care about a single other character besides Senua because they all lacked depth and necessary character development, which could have been present if they allowed for their presence in the story to be more prominent. With the little nuggets we get from them, there are clearly some well-written characters with interesting arcs hidden underneath, but it's never fully explored. The same goes for the overall plot. It felt like the second act was just not present, or at the very least a large section was just not there. To me, it felt like I spent half of the game in the first act, and then we suddenly jump to the third where all the characters are apparently developed, and thus any emotional payoff they try to elicit by the end does not feel earned. While I've mentioned the Order 1886 draws a lot of parallels to this game when it comes to cinematics, length, and aspect ratio, this was at least one thing I actually preferred over this. I was actually drawn to the characters. I actually cared for them. And unfortunately, I can't say the same here. I couldn't even tell you any of the names of the characters in Hellblade 2. That's usually a telltale sign when you can't. But I can still recall the names of every member aboard the Normandy and Mass Effect all these years later. It just feels disappointing because I can see there's something here, but with these seeming omissions, it just feels disjointed. The ending especially threw me for a whirl. Just as things in the last hour were starting to pick up and were finally starting to get interesting, the game suddenly ended very abruptly. It was truly baffling. I also find it incredibly lazy to chalk things up to questioning whether or not what happened was actually real. It feels like a cop-out, one that allows you to do anything without constraints and call it a day. But either way, these concepts and themes and ideas that they're trying to explore end up just overall feeling really shallow because they either aren't explored enough or they try to retread common ground. And it just all seems incredibly surface level. This game retails for 50 USD or 70 Canadian, and honestly I can't justify spending that much. I know it's on Game Pass and it softens the blow and is how I played it on my Series X, but some people rather feel ownership over their games, which they can't really do since this is a digital release, unfortunately, like Alan Wake 2 was. Also, I think it's very important to note, if you click on New Game in the menu, it'll delete your current save without warning, even if accidental. It's a shame really, and I hope Ninja Theory adds an update to this because it's ridiculous to lose all those hours, even if it isn't really that long. Also, if you want to sprint, do yourself a favor and switch from hold to toggle in settings to save your index finger because, oh boy. On a more positive and optimistic note, I know they're working on Project Mara alongside the next project that was recently greenlit, which is exciting. And whether or not it's Hellblade 3 or something else entirely, I'm really hoping that they take these criticisms into consideration and develop a game that strikes a better balance between the narrative and the gameplay, or zeroes in on one of them and exclusively focuses on it, rather than rushing both of them to the finish line, making both suffer in the long run. Taking time to either curate puzzles and combat more, or axe it completely for a better gameplay system that works for the narrative they're trying to tell. Perhaps even within a different medium if it serves it better. In other words, concentrate on one aspect and master that if you can't do both. And if it's a story that is better suited as a movie or a show or a novel or a podcast of some sort, then don't be afraid to tell it in that medium. Because while I've been pretty negative towards this game, I really do think that there's something here, something great hidden underneath. And maybe someday we can dig a little deeper. I just really wish that day was today.